The first thing they noticed about the Zintrax envoy was the smell, like a cross between a wet dog and a used air filter. Consul Varen Thorn tried not to wrinkle his nose too much as he extended a hand, an empty, polite gesture he knew the Zintrax didn't understand and probably wouldn't reciprocate. But hey, gestures. They were what diplomacy was built on, especially when every other option involved disintegration beams. "Welcome to Titan," Ambassador Kalvax Thorn said, his voice as smooth as the synthetic whiskey he reserved for less alien company. His words echoed strangely in the cavernous embassy hall where human engineers had tried, and failed, to make the place look less like an abandoned mining colony and more like a slice of Earth. The attempt was valiant, but still about as convincing as a politician's promise. Kalvax loomed a good head taller than Thorn, all sinew and scales, with eyes the color of radioactive sludge. "Consul Thorn," it replied, in a voice that suggested it gargled with gravel each morning. "The honor is mutual." "Fantastic," Thorn said, clapping his hands together in a manner that suggested he was about to sell Kalvax a timeshare on a sunken island. "We've got quite the agenda today. Tours, talks, and then a little cultural exchange." He waggled his eyebrows suggestively, which was lost on the alien but appreciated by his human staff, who snickered quietly. Cultural exchange. That was one way to put it. Varen Thorn's big plan to ensure human-Zintrax relations didn't evolve into a weaponized misunderstanding involved introducing the Zintrax elite to a series of Earth's most beloved pastimes, gambling games. What could go wrong? As they walked through the embassy, a feat of architecture that somehow combined brutalist concrete with second-hand starship parts, Thorn gave his best tour guide smile. On your left, you'll see the mural, depicting the heroic escape from Earth's overpopulation crisis. On your right, our state-of-the-art hydroponics bays. We've got a killer salad bar. Kalvax made a noise that might have been agreement or indigestion. Hard to tell with a species whose primary form of communication was pheromonal. "I see you have invested heavily in your history, more like invested heavily in not repeating it," Thorn said. "Nothing says forward thinking like making sure you've got a place to escape to when the next apocalypse rolls around." Behind them, Thorn's aide, a wiry woman named Jess Kitteridge, whispered in his ear, "You're laying it on thick, boss." "Almost as thick as the smog out there. Just getting started," Jess, Thorn replied, grinning as they entered a large room buzzing with human and Zintrax alike. Tables were arranged in neat rows, each set with chips, cards, and dice. The scene looked like a seedy casino had crashed into a United Nations summit. "Welcome to our cultural exchange," Thorn said, gesturing broadly. "Or as we like to call it, the most fun you can have with your clothes on that doesn't involve a gravity generator." Kalvax surveyed the room with what could generously be called interest. "These games, they determine status among your kind." "Not exactly," Thorn said. "More like they determine how much money you have left to pay your rent. It's a great way to get to know someone. Or to learn how they handle losing everything in an afternoon." The Zintrax ambassador watched as a human dealer shuffled cards with the speed and precision of a magician trying to impress a blind audience. "And what do you hope to gain from this exchange?" Thorn chuckled, a sound that was only mildly sinister. "Oh, just good, old-fashioned camaraderie. Maybe a little insight into each other's cultures. And if we're really lucky, we might learn how to bluff a Zintrax into folding a royal flush." Jess sidled up to Thorn, her expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. "You're really betting our diplomatic future on card games, and the hope that aliens really suck at poker. That's the plan," Thorn said, unperturbed. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? A few lost wagers, a broken table. A minor interstellar incident. No big deal." She rolled her eyes. "You realize if this goes south, it's not just your ass on the line, right? We're all screwed, literally and metaphorically." "Ah, but if it goes right, we're heroes," Thorn replied. "And I promised my mother I'd be a hero." This could be her only chance to brag at the card club. Meanwhile, Kalvax was eyeing the poker table with a level of suspicion usually reserved for malfunctioning airlock doors. The Zintrax were nothing if not cautious, their empire built on a foundation of strategic paranoia and the occasional well-timed backstab. One of the junior diplomats, a fresh-faced kid named Carlo who had all the diplomatic finesse of a caffeinated squirt, took it upon himself to approach the alien. "Care to try your hand, ambassador? It's pretty simple, just don't lose your confidence is," noted, Kalvax said, its tone as dry as a sandstorm on Mars. "I will observe first. Observation's the first step to participation," Carlo said breezily, missing the mark by a solar system. "Once you get the hang of it, you'll see it's all about reading people's faces. Kind of a problem here since you guys are hard to read, but hey, that's part of the challenge." Back at the main table, Thorn's attention shifted to the rest of the room, where humans and Zintrax were mingling in that awkward way people do when they are trying really hard not to offend each other. A few brave souls were already participating in a game of craps, the dice clattering like bones. Another table was knee-deep in a tense round of blackjack, where a Zintrax player was staring so intently at their hand, it was a wonder their eyes didn't melt the cards. "You think they're buying it?" Jess asked, sidling up again with a tumbler of something amber and hopeful. "I think we've got their attention," Thorn replied. "Now it's just a matter of keeping it long enough for them to see we're not half as crazy as we seem, or twice as crazy," Jess muttered, taking a sip and eyeing the room like a cat watching a room full of rocking chairs. "Potato, potato," Thorn said, as he moved to the next table, ready to play ambassador/pit boss. He watched as Kalvax finally sat down, curiosity overcoming whatever alien equivalent of skepticism it was feeling. The Zintrax's eyes were fixed on the chips, fingers drumming a rhythm that could have been impatience or sheer alien glee. "Congratulations," Thorn said, slipping in beside Kalvax. "You're about to partake in the second oldest profession known to humanity." The first being, of course, complaining about the second. Kalvax tilted its head in a manner that suggested it was trying to grasp the concept of humor. "And what is the purpose of this? Activity, fun," Thorn said. "Connection. The idea that sometimes it's okay to take a risk. You can't always calculate every outcome. Sometimes you've just got to roll the dice and see what happens. It's a philosophy. Or a stupid way to lose money. Either way, it's very human." The Zintrax ambassador reached for the deck, its long fingers surprisingly delicate. "I will participate. For research purposes, of course," Thorn said, the grin barely contained on his face. "For science." Around them, the room buzzed with the sounds of cards being dealt, chips clinking, and the low hum of conversation. It was a symphony of chance, the kind of chaos humans thrived in. As the first round began, Jess leaned close to Thorn again. "You think this'll work? I think if we can teach an alien how to bluff, we might just have a shot at peace," Thorn replied. "And if not," Thorn shrugged, eyes on the table as Kalvax examined its hand with deadly seriousness. "Then at least we'll have one hell of a story to tell when the galaxy goes to hell." With that, the game was on. The stakes were high, the tension palpable, and in that moment, as cards were revealed and bets placed, humanity's future lay not in the hands of diplomats or generals, but in the uncertain roll of a cosmic dice. Because sometimes the fate of the world wasn't decided by treaties, but by the simple, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the other guy had an even worse hand than you did. Humanity's future, at least in the eyes of Consul Varen Thorn, was currently dealt with chips and cards. The Zintrax, an alien race as inscrutable as any tax form, were unexpectedly getting the hang of Earth's most cherished pastime, gambling. Ambassador Kalvax sat at the poker table, eyes glowing like a pair of malfunctioning neon signs. As the rounds progressed, it became evident that the Zintrax were not just playing, they were thriving. And not in the way a toddler thrives on sugar and chaos, but in the way a wolf thrives on an unsuspecting rabbit. Thorn watched, a mix of awe and mild panic wrestling across his features. It was somewhat unsettling to witness an alien species embrace gambling with the zest of a college student with a fake ID entering Vegas for the first time. The Zintrax were lean, mean gambling machines. Who knew? Around the room, the buzz was palpable. Humans and Zintrax mingled, with the latter gradually adopting some of the more refined human traits, like how to double down on a pair of tens. There was laughter, animated conversation, and the unmistakable clink of credits changing hands. The air smelled of money, desperation, and oddly enough, hope. Kira Mendel, a young envoy with a knack for stating the obvious with the subtlety of a freight train, watched the unfolding scene with growing concern. She sidled up to Thorn, who was doing a passable impression of a man who hadn't just bet his career on a card game. "Thorn," Kira said, her voice pitched low enough to be private, but loud enough to convey urgency. "You might want to rein it in before the Zintrax decide they want to buy Titan with their winnings." "Relax, Kira," Thorn replied, eyes fixed on Kalvax as the ambassador raked in another pot. "It's just some harmless fun. What's a few credits between friends?" Kira's eyebrows shot up. "Harmless fun. These guys are calculating odds like they're plotting the downfall of an empire. At this rate, they'll own the embassy by next week." Thorn chuckled, a sound that suggested he was more amused by the impending doom than troubled by it. "And here I thought you'd be happy to see them engage with our culture." "Engage, yes. End up destabilizing the local economy. Less so," Kira shot back. "Look at them, Thorn. They're hooked indeed." Kalvax was currently engaged in a fierce stare-down with the dealer, a look that promised annihilation should the cards not fall in his favor. Around the table, human players were sweating bullets, and not just because the air conditioning had conked out again. "I see your point," Thorn admitted, a touch reluctantly, "but maybe this is good, a mutual understanding. They learn to loosen up, we learn about perseverance under pressure, or they learn how to bankrupt us in a day." Thorn shrugged, the universal gesture for what can you do. Look, Kira, I get it, but we've got to let them have this. Besides, who'd have thought the Zintrax were such card sharks? Not me, Kira said, eyes narrowing as Kalvax pulled off a spectacular bluff. But I'm starting to think we should have introduced them to rock, paper, scissors instead. Meanwhile, the stakes at the poker table climbed higher. The pot was a gleaming mountain of credits, chips, and the occasional IOU from a particularly desperate human diplomat. Kalvax was in the thick of it, leaning back with an air of supreme confidence that screamed, "Come at me, bro," in every universal language. A human player, face ashen, made the mistake of trying to stare down the Zintrax ambassador. It was like trying to outglare a supernova. Kalvax's gaze was unyielding, a mix of curiosity and calculation. In this moment, the Zintrax were truly in their element. And then, Kalvax made his move. It was a masterstroke of alien cunning, a bluff that would have made seasoned poker veterans weep with envy. The human player folded, retreating with a sigh that suggested he'd just lost his faith in humanity's ability to outsmart alien invaders. Kalvax's winnings piled higher, a testament to either beginner's luck or a natural talent for risk-taking. This was not lost on the other Zintrax, who were watching with interest. Some had already joined other games, testing their skills at craps, roulette, and a particularly volatile variant of blackjack that involved a small electric shock for every losing hand. Thorn, ever the optimist, clapped Kalvax on the back with a grin. "See, you're getting the hang of it." "Not bad for your first time." Kalvax inclined his head, a glimmer of what could only be described as smug satisfaction in his radioactive eyes. "It is a stimulating experience. The unpredictability is refreshing, that's one way to put it," muttered Jess Kitteridge, who'd been keeping a wary eye on the proceedings. "I'd call it terrifying, but hey, to each their own." Kira, still unconvinced, crossed her arms. "You know, this could be problematic. If they keep winning, it's going to have repercussions." Thorn waved a dismissive hand. "That's tomorrow's problem, Kira. Right now, we're showing the Zintrax a good time. And who knows, maybe they'll go back home and start their own casinos." Kira wasn't buying it. "Or they'll go back home and start annexing planets to bankroll their new habit. Come on, not every interaction has to end in an interstellar war," Thorn said, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. But Kira wasn't letting it go. "You remember the last cultural exchange, the one with the culinary tasting, ended with a food fight and 3 new alien dietary prohibitions." Thorn winced at the memory. That particular incident had been a mess, literally and diplomatically. Point taken. But this is different. This is progress. Progress towards what exactly? Kira pressed. "A galaxy-wide debt crisis." Thorn didn't reply immediately, instead watching Kalvax as the ambassador signaled for another round. The Zintrax were learning, adapting. It was unnervingly impressive. Jess sidled back, a fresh drink in hand. "We need to talk strategy, Thorn. If this keeps up, we're gonna have to start paying them to leave." "Ever the pragmatist," Thorn said with a grin. "Someone's gotta be," Jess replied, eyes scanning the room. "Besides, the real worry is back home. Imagine trying to explain to Earth's council why the Zintrax bought half our solar system using poker chips." Kira nodded vigorously. "Exactly. This isn't just a game, Thorn. It's a potential diplomatic nightmare, or a diplomatic miracle," Thorn suggested somewhat lamely. "They're engaged. They're participating. It's something, Kira agreed, but not necessarily something good." While the humans debated, the Zintrax continued their winning streak. The aliens seemed to thrive on the thrill, the risk, the potential for loss and gain. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and soon, more Zintrax were joining in, eager to test their mettle against human intuition and luck. Kalvax, now a bona fide celebrity among his peers, was teaching his fellow Zintrax the finer points of Texas Hold'em. It was a surreal sight, an alien ambassador explaining the intricacies of poker to his kind, complete with gestures that suggested he'd been watching too many old Earth westerns. "Is it just me, or are they getting too good at this?" Kira asked, voice low enough for only Thorn and Jess to hear. "That's not just you," Jess said, glancing at a Zintrax who'd just completed a perfect roulette spin. "We might be creating monsters here." Thorn sighed, rubbing his temples. "Okay, so maybe we need to rethink our approach. But for now, let's see where this goes. Hopefully not to our financial ruin," Kira muttered, watching as yet another human player folded under Kalvax's unrelenting gaze. The room was electric, a strange blend of cultural exchange and competitive frenzy. Humans and Zintrax alike were immersed in the games, the thrill of victory and the sting of defeat shared across species lines. It was a sight to behold, and yet underneath it all there lurked the potential for chaos. Because, as Kira had so astutely pointed out, this wasn't just about cards and chips. It was about trust, understanding, and the delicate balance of power between 2 very different worlds. And as the night wore on, Thorn couldn't help but wonder what the morning would bring, a newfound camaraderie or a fresh set of challenges. Either way, he knew one thing for sure. The Zintrax had taken to Earth's games with a fervor that was as impressive as it was alarming. "Here's to cultural exchanges," Thorn said, raising an imaginary glass. "And here's hoping we don't regret it." Jess clinked her actual glass against his invisible one, a wry smile on her face. "To the fine line between diplomacy and disaster," Kira nodded, her expression serious. "And to figuring out what the hell comes next." As the night continued and the games played on, it was clear that Thorn and his team had their work cut out for them. The Zintrax were learning fast and the stakes were higher than ever. But if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was adapting to change. And if Thorn had any say in it, they'd find a way to make this work, one way or another. In the dimly lit embassy hall on Titan, where the air smelled faintly of desperation and bad decisions, Consul Varen Thorn leaned against a wall that had seen better days. It was supposed to resemble Earth, but the human engineers missed the mark. Instead, it looked like a cross between a haunted house and a garage sale rejected by the universe. Kira Mendel, the ever-dutiful envoy, joined him, her expression a mix of bemusement and simmering concern. "Thorn, I'm starting to think we might have taught the Zintrax the wrong kind of diplomacy," Kira said, nodding towards the poker tables, where Ambassador Kalvax was once again dealing out destruction with the casual air of someone ordering a coffee. Thorn, ever the optimist in the face of encroaching disaster, gave a nonchalant shrug. "What's the worst that could happen? They can't exactly repossess a planet, right?" Kira rubbed her temples. "You'd be surprised. There's rumors they're tightening their belts back home. Apparently even aliens have budgets, really." Thorn scratched his chin thoughtfully, as if he'd just discovered a new species of dust bunny clinging to his jacket. "Well, that's encouraging. At least they're not blowing everything on our games, right?" Kira snorted. "You're assuming they know what a budget is. For all we know, budget might translate to fun money for Earth gambling in their language." Across the room, Kalvax was busy proving that theory right. His glowing eyes scanned the cards with a precision that was more machine than man, though his poker face was undeniably organic, a mixture of inscrutability and smug satisfaction that made the other players squirm. Chips were exchanged, credits flowed like water, and tensions rose faster than a rocket-powered elevator. The human players were an odd bunch, a mix of diplomats, engineers, and a few volunteers who'd been roped in to make up numbers. They were losing, and losing badly, like lambs to a particularly enthusiastic slaughterhouse. "You know," said Jess Kitteridge, the embassy's resident cynic, "if the Zintrax keep winning, we might have to start trading airlocks for chips." "I don't think Earth's council will like that." Thorn chuckled, though it sounded a lot like a man trying to laugh off a hangman's noose. "Think of it as an investment. We're fostering interstellar relations." "Sure," Jess replied, sipping her drink with the casual air of someone who'd seen it all. "Just remember to tell them that when we're living in space tents because the Zintrax own the embassy." Kira shook her head. "It's not just about losing credits. The Zintrax are getting restless. They've got resources tied up back home, and now they're spending more time here than a bull in a china shop." "Diplomacy's all about risk," Kira, Thorn said, though the confidence in his voice was wavering like a poorly built bridge in a storm. "Sometimes you've got to play the hand you're dealt. Yeah, and sometimes you fold before you lose your shirt." Kira shot back, eyeing Kalvax as he raked in another pot. "If they start pulling back resources from their empire, it could destabilize things. And who do you think they'll blame us?" Thorn ventured, though he sounded less sure with each passing second. "Bingo, and that's not a game we want to play." Meanwhile, the Zintrax contingent continued their winning spree, blissfully unaware of the chaos their newfound hobby was causing. Kalvax led the charge, his alien charisma turning the tables into a spectacle that was part show, part slaughter. Poker had become their new religion, Kalvax their high priest, and the embassy their temple. "Think we should tell them that gambling's not usually this easy," Jess mused, watching as another human player slid his remaining chips over with the resignation of a man who'd just realized he bet more than his dignity. "Why ruin their fun?" Thorn replied half-heartedly. "Besides, they're learning. Isn't that what cultural exchanges are all about, learning how to bankrupt us?" "Yeah, great exchange," Kira sighed, the weight of impending doom pressing heavily on her shoulders. "We've got to do something. If the Zintrax start pulling their fleets back to cover losses, it's going to leave a power vacuum. The last thing we need is another war. Wouldn't be the first time a card game led to a galactic conflict," Jess muttered, a dark twinkle in her eye. "Remember the Tharn Accord disaster? Don't remind me," Thorn groaned. "If I never see another intergalactic treaty written on a cocktail napkin, it'll be too soon." Kira took a deep breath, steadying herself. "All right, we need a plan. We can't let this spiral out of control." Thorn nodded, though his mind was racing faster than a quantum particle on a caffeine high. Okay, we'll talk to them. Explain the situation. Maybe they'll listen, and if they don't," Jess asked, arching an eyebrow, "then we'll wing it." Like always, as if on cue, Kalvax approached, his expression one of curious amusement. You seem tense, he observed, his voice a smooth blend of curiosity and calculation. Do we? Thorn replied, mustering a smile that felt more like a grimace. Must be the lighting, Kalvax nodded, as if this was the most reasonable explanation he'd ever heard. Your games are enlightening, but I sense a disturbance. Is there a problem with the chips? Not exactly, Kira said, choosing her words with the care of a bomb disposal expert. We're just a bit concerned about the enthusiasm you and your people have shown for our games. Concerned, Kalvax repeated, his head tilting slightly, the universal gesture for I have no idea what you're talking about, but please continue. Thorn cleared his throat. It's just we've noticed you've been spending a lot of time and resources on the games. Maybe more than is wise, Kalvax's eyes gleamed, a sign that he was either amused or about to challenge Thorn to a duel. We find these games fascinating. They offer a unique insight into your species. Psyche, right? Jess interjected, unable to contain herself. But maybe slow down before you figure out too much and buy Titan by accident. Kalvax chuckled, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Fear not, we have no interest in purchasing your moon. The property taxes alone would be prohibitive. The humans exchanged glances, half relieved, half wary. So you're aware of the strain this might be putting on your empire. Kira pressed, watching carefully for any flicker of realization. Kalvax nodded. Our leaders are monitoring the situation. Adjustments will be made. Adjustments, Thorn echoed, feeling a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the faulty air conditioning. Yes, Kalvax replied, quite cheerfully. We have reserves, and should we deplete them we will find alternatives. Alternatives, Jess repeated, clearly regretting her decision to ask. Like what? Bartering with stars? Kalvax's smile widened, a terrifying sight if ever there was one. Innovation is the essence of survival, is it not? As Kalvax returned to the table, Thorn, Jess, and Kira were left to ponder the implications of innovation in the hands of a card-counting alien race. The room buzzed with activity, the muted sounds of chips and shuffling cards a symphony of pending catastrophe. I don't like the sound of that, Kira said, her voice low and tense. Join the club, Jess replied, her sarcasm tinged with genuine concern. I'm starting to think we should have introduced them to hopscotch instead. Thorn rubbed his face as if trying to scrub away the weight of responsibility. This has to be managed delicately. We can't afford to upset the balance, a balance we threw off by teaching them to gamble like it's going out of style, Kira pointed out. Thorn nodded, resigned. Okay, so maybe we need to slow things down, make the games less of a focus. Good luck with that, Jess said, gesturing to the room where Zintrax and humans mingled, united by a shared love of reckless abandon. I'm not sure the cat's going back in the bag, then we'll get a bigger bag, Thorn replied, though his confidence was as flimsy as a paper spacesuit. And so, as the night wore on and Kalvax continued his winning streak, the humans plotted their next move. It was a complicated dance, one that required finesse, cunning, and perhaps a little bit of luck. But if Thorn and his team had learned anything in their time on Titan, it was that humanity thrived on adversity. Even if that adversity came in the form of alien card sharks threatening to turn an embassy into their personal casino. Well, Thorn said, raising his imaginary glass once more. Here's to hoping we can bluff our way out of this mess. Kira and Jess clinked their glasses against his, their expressions a mix of resolve and gallows humor. To the fine art of diplomacy, Kira said, a wry smile tugging at her lips. And to the cosmic joke that is our lives, Jess added, her sarcasm cutting through the tension like a laser. Thorn chuckled, though the sound was more weary than amused. Let's just make sure we're not the punchline. And with that, they steeled themselves for the challenges ahead, ready to face whatever the universe and the Zintrax threw their way. After all, in the grand game of diplomacy, the stakes were always high, and the rules were always changing. But if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was finding a way to tip the odds in their favor, one gamble at a time. The embassy hall on Titan buzzed with the low thrum of nervous energy, like a hive of bees that had just realized they were locked in a hunniless vault. The Zintrax poker tournament was in full swing, and Kalvax was, as usual, presiding over the table with the kind of serene assurance only someone who didn't have to worry about student loans or mortgage payments could muster. Meanwhile, Kira Mendel, Consul Varen Thorn, and Jess Kitteridge huddled in a corner that was doing its best impersonation of a shadowy recess, albeit failing due to the flickering, unreliable lighting. It was a setting that screamed budget cuts, which, as it turned out, was exactly the topic of discussion. You're telling me they've been borrowing? Thorn asked, incredulity painted on his face like a bad tattoo. The Zintrax. They've got an entire planet's worth of jewels and they're borrowing, Kira nodded, her expression a mix of exasperation and mild amusement, like a babysitter who'd just caught the kids attempting to microwave a spoon. Not just borrowing, scraping the barrel, selling off assets, and possibly planning to auction off their grandmothers. It's a financial circus, and they're the clowns, Holy hell, Jess murmured, shaking her head. What the hell kind of screwed up intergalactic episode of Pawn Stars are we running here? Thorne scratched his chin, a habit he'd developed that always seemed to coincide with his bouts of terrifying realization. If they are in this deep, it's not just a problem for them. It's a problem for everyone within a light-year radius, you think, Jess replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. If they crash and burn, it's going to be like tossing a trillion-ton bowling ball into a kiddie pool. We'll be drowning in fallout. Kira glanced back at the gaming table, where Kalvax was now explaining the precise mathematics behind a royal flush to a fellow Zintrax who looked like he'd just seen God. They're too invested, she said, her voice tight with the kind of tension that could snap titanium cables. We've got to get ahead of this before their entire empire goes bankrupt and takes us with it. Thorne nodded, his mind churning out ideas like a malfunctioning vending machine spitting out random snacks. We need leverage, something to make them see reason. If they're borrowing, they're vulnerable. Jess snorted, they're a walking target. Even the Ferox Guild wouldn't stoop this low, and they once tried to ransom an asteroid belt. Thorne grinned, though it was the kind of grin that suggested he'd just thought of something either brilliant or incredibly stupid. Exactly, we use their financial desperation to our advantage. Make them realize the risk isn't worth the potential gain, and how do you plan to do that? Jess asked, folding her arms with a skeptical eyebrow that could cut through steel. Hire a galaxy-wide billboard telling them to stop being idiots. No, Thorne said, warming to his theme. We show them the consequences. If they pull back resources, their rivals will pounce. They're risking interstellar instability for the sake of a card game, so we threaten them, Jess said, her smile more wolfish than a predator's reunion dinner. Real subtle, not threaten, Thorne corrected, trying to project the kind of assuredness that would make a poker face look like open transparency. We educate them. Present it as an opportunity to avoid disaster, Kira sighed, her patience wearing thinner than the paper napkins they'd been using as official documents. And if they don't listen, we find someone who will, Thorne replied, his voice firm with the kind of resolve that suggested he'd already burned his escape routes. There's got to be someone in their hierarchy not lost to the thrill of the game, someone less. Kalvaxy, Jess added, watching the ambassador collect his latest winnings with the kind of glee that would make a lottery winner look understated. Kira nodded, the hint of a plan forming like a storm cloud on the horizon. All right, let's find out who's still got their wits about them. Preferably someone who understands the concept of fiscal responsibility, or at least someone who can spell it, Jess quipped, rolling her eyes as she spotted another Zintrax attempting to use poker chips as a hat. This is turning into the worst episode of Galactic Economics 101 ever. The trio dispersed, their mission clear even if their confidence wasn't. As they mingled with the other guests, trying to look like they weren't quietly planning to avert an imperial disaster, the stakes were raised higher than a nervous gambler's blood pressure. Thorne approached a group of Zintrax officers, their uniforms hinting at rank and responsibility, though their expressions suggested neither was particularly high on their list of priorities. Evening, gentlemen, he began, his voice the epitome of diplomatic charm. Enjoying the festivities, one of the officers, a Zintrax named Yaller, nodded though his eyes betrayed more than a hint of weariness. Indeed, your games are. Captivating, Thorne repeated, trying to gauge if that was a good thing in their culture or a polite way of saying we're only here for the free drinks. But I wonder, have you considered the implications of such? Extensive engagement, Yaller's brow furrowed, a curious mix of confusion and caution. Implications, yes, Thorne said, seizing the opportunity like a cat with a particularly juicy mouse. The strain it might be putting on your resources, the potential for destabilization, the officers exchanged glances, a silent conversation that spoke volumes. We are aware, Yaller replied, his tone cautious. Our superiors assure us adjustments will be made. Adjustments, Thorne echoed, the word tasting like bitter irony on his tongue. And what if those adjustments lead to complications? Another officer, one whose name tag read Vexar, shrugged with a casualness that could have been taught at a university for the blithely uninformed. Complications are part of life, are they not? Thorne nodded, though inwardly he was cursing the day he'd ever agreed to a posting on Titan. They are, but sometimes they can be avoided. Yaller's gaze sharpened, as if he'd just realized there was more to this conversation than idle chit-chat. And you are suggesting we take steps to avoid them? Exactly, Thorne said, his smile as diplomatic as a peace treaty signed in crayon. We can help each other, ensure mutual benefit. Vexar chuckled, a sound like grinding gears. Your concern is noted, Consul. But our leaders are not easily swayed. Maybe not, Thorne admitted, his mind racing through possibilities like a gambler trying to count cards in a hurricane. But perhaps they would listen to someone who understands the risks. And you believe you know someone? Yaller asked, intrigued despite himself. Possibly, Thorn replied, thinking of Kalvax and the web of connections that underpinned the Zintrax diplomatic corps. But it requires cooperation, an exchange of valuable information. The officers exchanged a look, the kind that suggested they were weighing the odds and finding them less than favorable. But they didn't immediately refuse, and that, Thorn realized, was as good as a royal flush. Consider it a gamble, he said, the irony not lost on him. One that might save us all a great deal of trouble. Vexar nodded slowly, the wheels in his mind turning with the deliberate precision of an ancient clock. We will consider your proposal, Consul Thorn, but know that we are not without options. Of course not, Thorn replied, his smile as genuine as a counterfeit credit slip. But sometimes the best option is the one you didn't see coming. With that, he left them to mull over his words, praying that the seeds of doubt he'd planted would take root before the entire situation exploded like a poorly maintained reactor. As he rejoined Kira and Jess, he couldn't help but wonder if they'd bitten off more than they could chew. Any luck? Kira asked, her eyes scanning the room for potential allies or, failing that, the nearest escape route. Maybe, Thorn said, though he sounded less sure of himself than he'd have liked. They're aware of the risk, but whether they'll act. Jess snorted, her amusement tinged with the kind of dark humor that suggested she'd already booked tickets on the next evacuation shuttle. Let's hope they do. Otherwise, we're going to need more than luck, and maybe a miracle, Kira added, her voice tight but determined. Thorn glanced around the room, wondering if his next move would be his last. The stakes were as high as they'd ever been, and the only certainty was that trouble was looming like a storm on the edge of sight. Then let's get to work, he said, his resolve as firm as he could muster. We've got a galaxy to save, one gamble at a time, and with that they set about their task, navigating the murky waters of interstellar diplomacy with all the grace and finesse of a three-legged cow on a tightrope. The odds were stacked against them, but if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was defying those odds, even if it meant bluffing their way to galactic peace. The embassy hall on Titan had seen better days, though that was like saying a black hole was a bit peckish. The place was humming with the kind of nervous energy you'd expect from a group of people who'd just realized they were gambling with loaded dice, and not in their favor. Thorn, Kira, and Jess were doing their best to blend in, though that was akin to trying to hide a hangover at a breakfast meeting. The Zintrax had decided to tighten their grip on the poker tournament like a miser with a grudge. Apparently, there were whispers of foul play, not that anyone in the place was innocent enough to cast the first stone. It was as if the Zintrax had finally cottoned on that not all humans were there just for the buffet and cultural exchange. I feel like I'm being watched, Kira muttered, eyeing the Zintrax security detail that had materialized out of nowhere. They loitered around the edges of the room, their presence as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face. That's because you are, Jess replied, her voice carrying the kind of dry amusement that suggested she was one bad decision away from heading back to Earth and opening a bar. They're onto us. Or at least they're onto something. Might be the scent of desperation clinging to our skin. Thorn scratched his chin, a nervous tick that had become as comforting as it was concerning. We need to keep our heads down and our cards close. If they suspect we're meddling, we might as well pack up and call it a day. Great, Jess said, her sarcasm as thick as the sludge they called coffee around here. Because I always wanted to experience intergalactic failure up close. Look on the bright side, Kira said with a smile that was about as genuine as a 3-credit bill. At least we'll have front-row seats to the downfall of an empire. Not everyone gets to say that. Unless you're Zintrax, Thorn added, watching Kalvax from across the room. The ambassador was still presiding over the games with the kind of serene assurance that suggested he either knew something they didn't or simply didn't care. Probably both. With the Zintrax tightening security, the humans' advantage had all but evaporated. Their plan, which had seemed brilliant in the kind of late-night desperation that usually ended with regrettable tattoos, was cracking under the strain. Thorn felt the pressure mounting, like a dam about to burst, and the sense of urgency in the room was palpable. Is it just me, or are we losing control of this situation faster than a shuttle with a busted thruster? Kira whispered, her eyes darting around the room. Not just you, Thorn said, trying to maintain a veneer of calm. We're definitely in the thick of it. If we can't find a way to tip the scales back in our favor, this whole thing's going to blow up in our faces. Optimism, thy name is Thorn, Jess quipped, though her smile was strained. So what's the plan, mastermind? He pondered for a moment, the wheels in his head turning with the sluggishness of a rusty cog. We need to find out what they're planning. Any slip-ups, any signs of instability. We can't afford to let them dictate the terms. Great plan, Jess said, sarcasm dripping from her words like acid rain. And how exactly do you propose we do that? By being subtle, Thorn said, though he didn't sound wholly convinced. Subtle, Jess repeated, snorting. In case you hadn't noticed, subtlety isn't exactly our strong suit. Speak for yourself, Kira interjected, the hint of a smirk playing on her lips. I once went 2 whole hours at a diplomatic gala without calling anyone an idiot. Small victories, Thorn said dryly. But for now, we need to keep our ears to the ground and our mouths shut. If we can catch wind of their next move, we might have a fighting chance. Jess glanced at the gaming tables, where Zintrax and humans were mingling with the enthusiasm of people trying to make the best of a bad situation. And if we can't, Thorn shrugged, his nonchalance masking the gnawing dread in his gut. Then we improvise. We're good at that, right? Kira chuckled, though it was a bleak sound. Improvisation, the cornerstone of human diplomacy. They dispersed into the crowd, mingling with the kind of forced cheer that wouldn't fool a blind man. The Zintrax were on high alert, and Thorn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by more than just the security detail. It was as if the walls themselves had grown eyes, and he didn't much like what they might be seeing. As he moved through the throng, he noticed Kalvax watching him, a smile playing at the ambassador's lips that suggested he was enjoying this little dance far too much. Thorn met his gaze, nodding politely, though it felt like trying to be nice to a snake just before it bit you. They needed to find someone, anyone, in the Zintrax hierarchy who might be sympathetic to their cause. Someone who could see past the immediate allure of chips and cards to the looming disaster lurking just over the horizon. But the Zintrax were nothing if not inscrutable. Trying to read their expressions was like trying to decipher a particularly aggressive crossword puzzle, and the stakes were considerably higher. Thorn spotted Yaller again, the Zintrax officer he'd spoken to earlier. He sidled over, attempting to appear casual despite the fact his heart was pounding like a malfunctioning hyperdrive. "Evening, Yaller," Thorn greeted, his voice as smooth as he could manage under the circumstances. "Things still running smoothly, as smooth as expected," Yaller replied, though his eyes were fixed on the gaming tables with a kind of wary intensity. "But there are concerns." "Concerns?" Thorn echoed, trying to keep his tone light. Yaller nodded, his expression guarded. "Rumors of interference. We are tightening security to ensure the integrity of the games." "Absolutely," Thorn said, nodding as if he hadn't a care in the world. "Integrity is paramount. Wouldn't want things to get out of hand." Yaller gave him a long, searching look, the kind that suggested he was weighing Thorn's words with the precision of a jeweler examining a dubious diamond. "Your presence here is of interest. We're just here to help," Thorn assured him with a smile that hadn't convinced anyone since the dawn of time. "Mutual cooperation and all that, of course," Yaller said, though he didn't sound all that convinced. The Zintrax officer glanced around, as though ensuring they weren't being overheard. "But perhaps you could speak with Kalvax. He seems receptive to your ideas." Thorn nodded cautiously. "We'll do that." "Always good to have an ambassador who's open to new perspectives." "Indeed," Yaller replied, though he looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else. "But tread carefully. Not all are as accommodating." Thorn nodded, trying to suppress the insistent voice in his head screaming about how dangerously close they were to tipping over the precipice. "Thanks for the advice, Yaller." As Yaller moved off, Thorn regrouped with Kira and Jess, who were both looking more harried than hopeful. "Well," Kira asked, her voice edged with exhaustion. "Yaller suggested we have a chat with Kalvax," Thorn said, trying to sound more positive than he felt. "Apparently, he's the most receptive to new ideas, if you can believe that," Jess snorted. "Considering the alternatives, I'd say that's like being the least aggressive ferox in a pit fight. Still, it's a lead," Thorn said, trying to rally the last dregs of his enthusiasm. "We need to make the most of it." "All right," Kira said, a determined glint in her eyes. "Let's see if we can't convince Kalvax to see things our way, or at least get him to see that financial ruin isn't something you can bluff your way out of," Jess added. They made their way through the crowd, each step fraught with more tension than a coiled spring. When they reached Kalvax, the ambassador was, predictably, ensconced in yet another game, his smile as serene as a man who never worried about where his next meal was coming from. "Ambassador Kalvax," Thorn began, adopting his most diplomatic tone. "Could we have a word?" Kalvax looked up, his expression inscrutable. "Of course, Consul Thorn. I was wondering when you might approach." Thorn shared a glance with Kira and Jess, who both shrugged as if to say, "Well, here goes nothing." He turned back to Kalvax, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've been discussing the current situation with some of your colleagues," Thorn said, choosing his words with the care of a man defusing a bomb, "and we're concerned about the impact this enthusiasm might have on both our peoples." Kalvax nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Your concern is understandable. However, I assure you our financial strategies are sound." "Sound as in stable or sound as in making a lot of noise before they collapse?" Jess asked, her sarcasm cutting through the air like a razor. Kalvax chuckled, a sound that was both disarming and unsettling. "I appreciate your humor, Ms. Kitteridge. But rest assured, we are well positioned to handle any fluctuations." "Fluctuations," Kira repeated, her skepticism as tangible as the walls around them. And what about complete collapses? The ambassador's smile didn't falter, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe interest, maybe amusement. Our models account for all scenarios, even interstellar financial meltdown. Thorn pressed, hoping against hope that Kalvax might be more open to reason than his compatriots. Kalvax leaned back, considering them with the air of a man weighing his options at a buffet. What do you propose, Consul? Thorn hesitated, knowing that this was the moment to lay his cards on the table. We propose a partnership. A way to mitigate risks on both sides, share our resources, our knowledge. We can help each other avoid the pitfalls of overextension. Kalvax was silent for a long moment, his gaze piercing, an intriguing proposal. But what guarantees can you offer? The guarantee that if we don't work together, we're all going to be knee-deep in a crisis faster than you can say credit swap, Jess said, her voice hard and unyielding. Kalvax's lips quirked upward in what might have been a smile. Your candidness is refreshing, MS. Kitteridge, it's what we're known for, Kira said, her expression devoid of anything resembling humor. Very well, Kalvax said, inclining his head slightly. I will consider your proposal. But know this, the decision is not mine alone. We understand, Thorn said, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. Thank you for your consideration, Ambassador. Kalvax nodded, his expression unreadable. You are welcome, Consul. Let us hope that this gamble pays off for all of us. As they turned away, Thorn felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. They'd taken a step forward, but whether it was toward salvation or disaster remained to be seen. Well, Kira said, her voice breaking the silence that had settled over them. That went better than expected. Depends on your expectations, Jess replied, though there was a hint of optimism in her tone. But yeah, I suppose it could have gone worse. Thorn nodded, his mind already racing with the implications of their conversation. We need to prepare for whatever comes next. We've got a lot riding on this, like our necks, Jess said, though she was smiling now, the kind of smile that suggested she might just enjoy the ride, no matter where it ended. Then we'd better make sure we don't lose our heads, Kira said, her resolve as firm as steel. Together they navigated through the thronging crowd, each step bringing them closer to the uncertain future that awaited. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together, come hell or high water, and considering their luck, it was probably going to be both. The crowd pulsed around them like a heart trying its best to keep a doomed patient alive. Thorn, Kira, and Jess stood to the side of the poker tables, where the Zintrax and humans were exchanging credits like sailors with no shore leave in sight. Kalvax had returned to his table, once again becoming the center of a swirling galaxy of chips and cards. Well, that was fun, Jess said, her voice dripping with enough sarcasm to drown a cat. Nothing quite like convincing an alien ambassador he's on a sinking ship. At least he didn't kick us out, Thorn replied, trying to find a silver lining in the dark clouds hovering over their heads. Or eat us. I've heard they do that when they're really pissed. Kira shook her head, her gaze locked on the tables. We've got to do something more than just talk. Words aren't exactly a strong deterrent against bankruptcy. Speaking of doing, Jess said, her eyes gleaming with mischief. I've got an idea. It's risky, so naturally it'll probably blow up in our faces, but it might just give us the advantage we need. You're not suggesting what I think you are you? Kira asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Jess grinned, the kind of grin that usually preceded things going explosively wrong. Oh, I am, but we need a distraction. Great, Thorn muttered. Sleight of hand with our lives on the line. What could possibly go wrong? Kira sighed, resigned but intrigued. All right, what's the plan? Jess leaned in, eyes darting around the room to ensure no unwanted ears were listening, or tentacles in the case of the Zintrax. Mendel's our girl. We get her to pull something flashy at the tables, something that'll make everyone stop and stare. And during the chaos, I gather some intel on their finances, Thorn finished, rubbing his temples. A heist in an embassy, why not? I'm sure there are easier ways to get kicked off Titan. Think of it as a challenge, Jess said, patting him on the back. Besides, who needs safety nets? Thorn chuckled darkly. Safety nets are for trapeze acts, not diplomats. All right, let's find Mendel. Finding Mendel in the sprawling embassy hall was easier said than done. The place was a labyrinth, its architecture only vaguely reminiscent of anything Earth-like, thanks to those well-meaning human engineers. Thorn imagined they were the same type who would design a spaceship with circular hallways just to mess with you. They eventually spotted Mendel near a corner table, where she was engaged in a game of her own. Coins clinked, cards flashed, and the room buzzed with the tension only high stakes and bad decisions could generate. Mendel, Jess called, sidling up to her. Got a moment? Mendel looked up, her expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. If it isn't my favorite troublemakers. What do you need? We need a distraction, Thorn said, laying it out as simply as possible. Something big enough to draw everyone's attention. Mendel smirked, leaning back in her chair. You know I live for the spotlight, but what's in it for me? Kira chimed in, her tone persuasive. The satisfaction of pulling one over on the Zintrax and maybe saving our collective asses in the process. Mendel tapped a finger on her chin, pretending to consider. All right, I'll bite, but only because I can't wait to see the look on Kalvax's face. That's the spirit, Jess said with a grin. Let's make some magic happen. The plan was simple, which, considering their luck, meant it would be anything but. Mendel would stage a spectacular win, one that would draw the attention of everyone from the dealers to the security detail. In the chaos, Thorn would slip into the back offices, using the distraction to access whatever data the Zintrax were hiding about their financial woes. The trio watched as Mendel set to work, her hands moving with the grace of a seasoned performer. She placed her bets, feigned uncertainty, then laid down her cards with the kind of flair that would make even the most seasoned con artist blush. It worked like a charm or a curse, depending on your perspective. The crowd gasped as Mendel's hand revealed itself, chips cascading across the table in a clatter that echoed through the hall. Even Kalvax, normally as unflappable as a stone in a river, looked momentarily taken aback. With the room's focus now on Mendel's miraculous victory, Thorn slipped away, his heart pounding like a drumline at a funeral march. The back offices were just as labyrinthine as the rest of the embassy, but years of evading unpleasant situations had honed his ability to navigate unfamiliar territory. He found the office, a room that was both opulent and practical, the kind of place where deals were made and secrets were kept. The computer system was alien in design, but Thorn had picked up a few tricks over the years. He accessed the terminal, fingers flying across the console as if they had a mind of their own. The information was buried deep, hidden behind layers of encryption that would give even the best slicer a headache. But desperation was a hell of a motivator, and Thorn wasn't about to let a little thing like technological superiority stand in his way. He found what he was looking for, data on the Zintrax's financial situation, the kind of intel that could turn the tide in their favor if leveraged correctly. The numbers painted a grim picture, one of overextension and misplaced confidence, akin to a house of cards teetering on the edge of a cliff. Thorn copied the data, securing it in a portable drive that he tucked into his jacket. He glanced around, ensuring no one had noticed his little excursion, then made his way back to the main hall, his heart still hammering in his chest. Back at the tables, Mendel was basking in the glory of her win, surrounded by onlookers, both human and Zintrax, who were caught between awe and disbelief. Jess and Kira joined Thorn as he returned to their side, their expressions a mix of relief and anticipation. "Get what you needed?" Kira asked, her voice low. "More than I hoped for," Thorn replied, patting his jacket. "This could be the key to unraveling their plans." "Perfect," Jess said, her grin wide. "Now we just need to figure out how to use it without getting ourselves spaced." Details, Thorn replied, though he couldn't deny the knot of worry forming in his gut. "Let's focus on the win for now." As the crowd around Mendel began to disperse, Kalvax approached, his expression one of practiced calm. "A most impressive display, MS. Mendel," he said, inclining his head. "I underestimated your prowess." Mendel shrugged, a picture of nonchalance. "Beginner's luck maybe, or just a good day at the tables." Kalvax's eyes flicked to Thorn, a hint of something unreadable in their depths. "And you, Consul Thorn, did you find our hospitality to your liking?" Thorn met his gaze, determined not to give anything away. "Your hospitality is always appreciated, Ambassador. You've certainly gone above and beyond." "Indeed," Kalvax said, though his tone suggested he knew there was more to the story. "I trust you'll find your stay here illuminating." Thorn nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Always a pleasure, Kalvax. I look forward to our continued cooperation." As Kalvax moved away, the trio exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. The stakes were higher than ever, but they now had a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless to turn the tables. "Now what?" Jess asked, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Now," Thorn replied, "we figure out how to use what we know without ending up as space debris." Kira chuckled, the sound dry and humorless. "Sounds like a plan. A reckless, probably suicidal plan, but a plan nonetheless. Wouldn't have it any other way," Thorn said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Let's get to work." They left the embassy hall, the weight of their mission pressing down on them like 1,000 tons of bad decisions. But for the first time since they'd arrived, Thorn felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but in a galaxy where hope was often in short supply, it was enough to keep them going. As they made their way through the winding corridors of the station, Jess couldn't help but comment, "You know, if we survive this, I might just take up poker. Seems like a safer bet than diplomacy." Kira laughed, the sound echoing off the metal walls. "Safer, maybe, but not nearly as exciting." "Exciting's one word for it," Thorn said, glancing at the data drive nestled safely in his jacket. "Let's just hope our luck holds out." With their goal clear and their path uncertain, the trio pushed forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, in a universe where the odds were rarely in their favor, they had no choice but to play the hand they'd been dealt, and play it well. The embassy hall on Titan was seething with discomfort, like a drunk uncle at a sober wedding. The humans and Zintrax intermingled with the kind of forced politeness that usually preceded a bar brawl. Somewhere in the middle, Consul Varen Thorn was trying to hold onto his patience, which was slipping away faster than his credits at a Zintrax poker table. "All right, Thorn," Jess said, her words as sharp as a serrated blade on a bad day. "We've got the data. Now, what's your grand plan to make sure we don't end up as cosmic confetti?" Thorn took a breath, the kind you take when you're about to dive into a pool with no water. "We need to leverage this intel. The Zintrax are teetering on the brink of financial oblivion. All it takes is a little nudge, and we'll have them dancing to our tune." Kira, always the voice of reason. That is, if reason had a sarcastic twin, snorted. "Nudge them, more like push them over a cliff and hope they learn to fly on the way down." "Exactly," Thorn replied, ignoring the pang of doubt gnawing at his stomach. "If we play this right, the Zintrax will have no choice but to accede to our demands. We expose their instability, and they'll be tripping over themselves to make nice." Jess grinned, the kind of grin usually reserved for people about to do something incredibly stupid. "I like it. It's reckless, dangerous, and has a 90% chance of backfiring. My kind of plan." Thorn nodded, pulling the data drive from his jacket like it was the Holy Grail, or at the very least, a decent substitute for one. "Let's find a quiet place where we can lay out our cards without attracting too much attention." They moved through the embassy halls with the kind of stealth only achieved by people who knew they were out of their depth. Mendel, having wrapped up her starring performance at the poker table, joined them with a spring in her step that suggested she enjoyed being the catalyst for potential interstellar chaos. "Did I miss the briefing on our impending doom?" Mendel asked, falling into step beside Thorn. "Not yet," Thorn replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But stick around, we're about to script it." They found a small, unused office that looked like it had been designed by a committee intent on making sure no one ever wanted to use it, perfect for their purposes. Thorn plugged the data drive into a console and brought up the information on a display. "All right," he said, pointing at the screen as if he was some kind of financial wizard. "Here's the deal. The Zintrax are in deeper than a miner on payday. They're leveraged up to their antennae, and one wrong move could send their economy into freefall." Kira squinted at the numbers, her expression one of bemused interest. "So we're banking on them being just as bad at finances as they are at poker." "Pretty much," Thorn replied. "If we threaten to expose this, they'll have to play ball to prevent a financial apocalypse." "Lovely," Mendel quipped, leaning back in her chair. "So we're basically holding a gun to their heads and hoping they don't call our bluff." "Technically, yes," Thorn admitted, rubbing his temples as if he could massage away the impending migraine. "But we're not bluffing. Their financial situation is as real as a Zintrax's third stomach. And let's be honest, nobody wants to see what's inside that." Jess chuckled, tapping her foot against the metal floor. "All right, fearless leader, what's our next move?" "We arrange a meeting with Kalvax," Thorn said, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath. "We present our demands and let him know just how screwed they are if he doesn't comply." Kira raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched into her features like a permanent marker. "And what if he calls our bluff?" "What then? Then we bluff harder," Thorn replied, trying to sound more convinced than he felt. "It's all about the smoke and mirrors." "Great," Jess said with a dry laugh. "We get to play magician and hope nobody notices the trapdoor." Thorn could only nod, knowing full well that they were walking a tightrope with a pit of spikes beneath, but he'd played in worse games with worse odds. This was just another hand to be dealt, albeit with slightly more explosive stakes. A few hours later, they were back in the embassy hall, where the tension was thick enough to cut with a dull knife. Kalvax, ever the picture of alien composure, agreed to meet them in one of the conference rooms decked out like a Las Vegas wedding chapel, gaudy and completely missing the point. Kalvax settled into a chair across from Thorn, his expression inscrutable, which was saying something for a species whose face could best be described as a Rorschach test gone wrong. "Consul Thorn," he began, his voice smooth as a politician at election time. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Thorn leaned forward, projecting an air of confidence that he absolutely did not feel. "Ambassador Kalvax, I appreciate your time. I'll get straight to the point. We've come into possession of some rather interesting financial data." Kalvax's expression didn't change, but there was a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. "Oh. And what might that entail?" "Your current economic standing is, to put it kindly, precarious," Thorn said, sliding the data across the table as if it were a hot potato. "One wrong move and your house of cards collapses." There was a pause, the kind that stretched out like an awkward first date. Kalvax finally picked up the drive, examining it with a casualness that was anything but. "And I suppose you have a proposition to accompany this revelation." A astute as always, Thorn replied, suppressing the urge to break into a sweat. We have certain terms that we believe will be mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial, Kalvax echoed, the corners of his mouth twitching in what might have been the Zintrax equivalent of a smile. A human euphemism for do what we say or else, I presume. In this case, yes, Thorn said, not bothering to deny it. You're dangling by a thread, Ambassador. We can help you save face if you're willing to meet us halfway. Kalvax considered the offer, his gaze scrutinizing Thorn as if he were a particularly challenging math problem. And if we're not inclined to accept, then this little financial hiccup becomes front-page news across the quadrant, Thorn replied, folding his arms. It'd be a shame to see such a promising relationship unravel over something as trivial as monetary embarrassment. There was a pause, and then Kalvax chuckled, a sound that was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. Humans. Always full of surprises. I try, Thorn said, allowing himself a small smile. So do we have a deal? Kalvax's expression shifted to one of contemplation, the weight of his decision evident in the set of his shoulders. It seems we do. Under the condition that our negotiations remain discreet. Discretion is our middle name, Thorn replied, knowing full well that discretion was more of an afterthought in their line of work. We'll work out the details and ensure that both our peoples come out of this looking like heroes. Kalvax rose, offering a hand, or the Zintrax equivalent, which involved a lot more fingers than Thorn was comfortable with. Then I look forward to seeing how our partnership develops. Thorn shook his hand, resisting the urge to grimace at the alien texture. Likewise, Ambassador. As Kalvax left the room, Thorn allowed himself to breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. The deal was set, and with it, the precarious balance of interstellar relations was maintained. The others joined him, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. Did we seriously just pull that off? Kira asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. Looks like it, Jess replied, her grin wider than ever. Guess we won't be getting space today. Let's not start celebrating yet, Thorn cautioned, though he couldn't help but share in their triumph. There's still plenty of room for things to go wrong. But for now, we've got the upper hand. Mendel shook her head, a laugh escaping her lips. You know, for a bunch of diplomats, we make a damn good team of con artists. And here I thought I left my gambling days behind, Thorn said, his tone wry. Guess some habits die hard. They left the room, the weight of their actions settling over them like a comfortable, if somewhat precarious, cloak. For the first time in days, the path ahead seemed manageable, the obstacles surmountable. As they stepped back into the chaos of the embassy hall, Jess couldn't resist a final quip. So what's next? Join a rock band? Start a cult? Kira grinned, the tension of their mission melting away. How about we just try to keep out of trouble for a while? Where's the fun in that? Mendel asked, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Thorn smiled, feeling a sense of camaraderie with his ragtag team. Let's just enjoy the moment. Who knows when it'll happen again? With the specter of interstellar conflict averted for now, they moved forward, ready to face whatever new challenges awaited. In a universe as unpredictable as theirs, it was the small victories that mattered, and this one was sweeter than most. As the dust settled over their daring gambit, Consul Varen Thorn allowed himself a moment to savor the bittersweet aroma of victory. It clung to the air like the aftermath of a bar brawl, promising both triumph and trouble. In their line of work, the two were often indistinguishable. Well, that wasn't a total disaster, Thorn muttered, glancing at Kira Mendel, who was leaning against the wall with the casual elegance of someone who'd just won a poker game with a pair of twos. Nope, just a mild catastrophe, Mendel replied, grinning like a cat who'd swallowed a particularly juicy canary, and we didn't even have to sell our souls. Yet Thorn chuckled, a sound that felt surprisingly good after the tension of the past few hours. Give it time, the night's still young. The embassy hall had returned to its usual chaos, with humans and Zintrax mingling in a dance of diplomatic dysfunction. The poker tables buzzed with activity, the flashing lights creating an ambience that was less Vegas glam and more existential crisis. Jess Kitteridge sauntered over, a glass of something suspiciously green in hand. So, how does it feel to have pulled off the impossible? She asked, her voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that could corrode metal. Like we just glued wings to a pig and watched it fly, Thorn replied, watching as Kalvax rejoined his Zintrax companions, who were already plotting their next move like a group of intergalactic chess players who'd just been checkmated by a toddler. Speaking of pigs, Jess said, nodding towards Kalvax, he took that surprisingly well. Almost makes you think he was expecting it. Well, when you're sitting on a financial time bomb, I guess you get used to the ticking, Kira remarked, taking a sip from her drink. Besides, nobody likes to lose face, especially not in front of a bunch of humans they consider barely evolved primates. Hey, we resemble that remark, Thorn quipped, though there was no denying the Zintrax had a point. Humanity was new to the galactic stage and stumbling along like a toddler in a room full of fragile antiques. Across the room, Kalvax was engaged in what looked like a heated discussion, his many fingers gesturing in a manner that suggested either deep contemplation or a sudden onset of interpretive dance. "Looks like the ambassador's got his own mess to clean up," Jess observed, taking a swig from her glass. "Better him than us," Mendel laughed, the sound bright and warm against the cold steel of the embassy's interior. "Yeah, for once, it's nice to be the ones watching the fireworks instead of running from them." Thorn nodded, feeling an unexpected rush of camaraderie as he looked at his mismatched crew of diplomats, each as irreverent and cynical as he was. "We've got ourselves a hell of a team," he said, meaning it more than he expected. "Who knew gambling with alien economies would be this much fun?" Mendel said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Next thing you know, we'll be taking over the galaxy. One credit at a time," Thorn agreed, feeling the weight of the data drive in his pocket, a reminder of the precarious alliance they'd just forged. As they stood there, basking in their minor victory, a Zintrax aide approached, their expression a curious blend of irritation and begrudging respect. "Consul Thorn, the ambassador wishes to convey his appreciation for your unique approach to diplomacy." Thorn exchanged a glance with his team, suppressing a grin. "Tell him we appreciate his open-mindedness," he said, managing to keep a straight face. The aide nodded, their antennae twitching in what Thorn hoped was sign language for "I can't believe I'm stuck dealing with these lunatics." With a final nod, the aide retreated, leaving them to their celebrations. "So, what's next on the agenda?" Jess asked, her tone suggesting that she'd be equally comfortable with a quiet night or a bar fight. "Damage control, I imagine," Kira said, her voice light but her gaze serious. "We've got a lot of explaining to do both here and back home, and a few bridges to build," Thorn added, knowing full well that their victory was only the beginning of a much longer and more complicated game. "More like a suspension bridge," Mendel quipped, "over a pit of lava. While someone's shooting at us with a laser cannon." "Exactly," Thorn said with a dry laugh. "Piece of cake." They made their way back to the conference room, where they could regroup and plan their next steps. The room was as unwelcoming as ever, but it had become their unofficial war room, a place where plans were hatched and futures decided. "So let's talk strategy," Thorn said, settling into a chair that seemed to have been designed by someone who'd never actually seen a human sit down. "We've got Kalvax on board, but we're going to need more than just his word to keep this alliance from unraveling." "Right," Kira agreed, leaning forward with the kind of intensity that usually preceded one of her more harebrained schemes. "We need to make sure the Zintrax see us as allies, not just opportunists, which means we have to keep them from realizing how much of this was luck," Jess interjected, her tone a blend of amusement and concern. "Well, let's not get too carried away," Mendel said with a wink. "We did have a plan after all." "Yeah, a plan with a 90% chance of backfiring," Jess shot back. "But hey, it worked, and that's what matters." "Exactly," Thorn said, knowing full well that their success had been a mix of strategy, improvisation, and sheer blind luck. "Now we just need to keep up appearances until we're in the clear." As they discussed their next moves, Thorn couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. Just days ago, they'd been a hodgepodge of diplomats sent to maintain the peace on a barren rock spinning around Saturn. Now, they'd managed to outmaneuver a race that had been playing the interstellar game for centuries. "Who'd have thought we'd end up here?" Kira mused, her voice thoughtful. "From scrambling to keep our heads above water to playing poker with an alien economy. We're living the dream," Thorn replied, glancing around at his team. "Or at least a dream. A strange, slightly terrifying dream," Mendel added, "but a dream nonetheless." As they wrapped up their impromptu meeting, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were still very much in uncharted waters, navigating a political landscape that could shift beneath their feet at any moment. But for now, they'd done what they set out to do. They'd secured humanity's place at the table, and that was no small feat. "All right, let's get some rest," Thorn said, rising from his chair with a sigh. "Tomorrow, we start putting the pieces together." "Rest," Jess said with mock horror. "I thought we were running on caffeine and adrenaline." "Speak for yourself," Mendel said with a yawn. "I'm running on the hope that we won't have to do this again anytime soon." As they left the room, Thorn felt a sense of satisfaction that was all too rare in their line of work. They'd accomplished something significant, something that would shape the future of human and Zintrax relations for years to come. And while the road ahead was fraught with challenges, he knew they were more than capable of facing them together. After all, they'd just bluffed an entire alien race into submission. How hard could the rest of it be? As they walked through the embassy halls, the weight of their accomplishment settled over them like a comfortable cloak, a reminder of what they'd achieved and what lay ahead. "So are we officially galactic heroes now?" Jess asked, her tone half joking, half serious. "Not quite," Thorn replied, a smile tugging at his lips, "but we're getting there. With that, they returned to their quarters, ready to face whatever new challenges awaited them in the morning. For tonight, they'd take their victory and hold it close, knowing that in a universe as unpredictable as theirs, moments like this were precious and all too rare. And as Thorn lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They'd done the impossible and come out on top, proving once and for all that humans were a force to be reckoned within the galaxy. As he drifted off to sleep, he knew that whatever happened next, they'd face it together, snark, sarcasm, and all, because in the end, that was what made them human, and that was what would see them through.